something that's right. Sometimes they say something that doesn't make much sense to us at all. I remember once I was in a meeting in the mosque where they were trying to throw out the sheikh. And the mosque, everybody was upset, and the one guy was saying, but you can't just throw the sheikh out. You have to at least show him some respect. You have to send him a letter. You have to go through a process. You can't just tell him, get out, you know. So one guy stood up and said, well, I think he ought to get out because he's always saying stuff that we've never heard before. And I thought to myself, well, have you heard everything? Do you know everything? And as the person who's supposed to lead us, can they ever challenge us? Can they ever say something to us that before we knee-jerk react to it because we don't like it, that at first we think about it? And even if it's one thing out of a million things that he said that was right, maybe we don't have to re-elect him, but we might can say, but stick around, you said something that made sense. The one thing, if George Bush hasn't said anything else that made sense, he did say this, and I'm going to end with this, and I hope that we will all remember it. The only way that we are going to win the war against terror is when we realize that we are not its only victims, and that we were too slow to get involved in the war, and that it's unfortunate that it wasn't until the war on terror struck us September 11th that we realized that there was a war going on. And that before it manifested itself as planes, as bombs slamming into buildings in the United States, it had manifested in the hearts of soul of little children in Cairo who were eating out of garbage cans. And little girls who were being held down while dull instruments were being used to circumcise them in brutal ways. The war on terror was going on in Afghanistan before September 11th, in the hearts of little girls who were wondering why they couldn't go out of their homes or why they couldn't go to school. It was going on already in Iraq, in the mass graves, and this has been my greatest disappointment as an American, particularly as a Muslim, that whenever I hear the people get up to talk about the war in Iraq, nobody even qualifies their distaste and hatred and disdain for this war with the fact that, but we did stop something. And that was the mass murder of a people who had no voice, an invisible people that had been murdered and buried in the sand, that no one grieved. They were human too. And in the prisons, like Abu Ghraib prison, we are very upset about that, and we should be. But did any of us see the pictures of the torture chambers after the troops had entered Iraq and gone for the first time into Abu Ghraib prison? And took the people and they did the tours, and some of them said, yeah, I was strung up there. So I guess what I want to say in closing, since my time is up, that we all need to get involved in the war on terrorism. But I think that what we're having a violent agreement. We need to figure out and define for ourselves exactly what is this war on terrorism? What are our objectives? What is it that we really can achieve? What can we win? Where does our victory lie in this war? And if we look beyond ourselves, then we will win. But if we continue to only look at ourselves, then we will lose. And that doesn't mean that we may ever be hit again by some catastrophic or horrific act. But it certainly does mean that each time we limit ourselves only to our own losses, our own pain, and our own experience, that somehow we are diminished and the rest of the world is moving on. I thank you for allowing me to be here with you.
Thank you. So the final speaker for the first half is Dr. Agha Saeed. He's a lecturer in the African American Studies Department at UC Berkeley, and he's the national chair of the American Muslim Alliance, and also the chair of the American Muslim Task Force on Civil Rights and Elections. He's also an author of a forthcoming book, Pakistan in Its Own Mirrors: Elite Autobiographies and National Consciousness. Agha.
Good evening. As I sat here and listened to two others and then a very thoughtful speaker, or two thoughtful speakers, who gave rather impersonal view of the situation, I was reminded of a scene in Hindu scripture, Bhagavad Gita. Those of you who have read it, is the scene of war, where the saint soldier, Arjuna, is confronted by Krishna, who is God incarnate. And it's the God incarnate who calls on him to fight. And Arjuna, who is supposed to be born to fight, this is his duty, this is his dharma, to fight. He raises a point that I believe is fundamental in this moment. He says, I don't want to fight, and gives a number of reasons, and then finally he says, for we know not if their victory or ours is better for us. And I think there might have emerged a moment in the world to reflect on that meaning and to say what kind of victory is good for us and will it ultimately serve our purposes that we are seeking. And second is the moment in the same scripture when supposedly the evil side has been defeated. And Krishna goes before Yudhishthira and bows before him and says, I bow before you because no good is entirely good and no bad is entirely bad. And I believe it creates two different conceptions. One which is Manichaeism, which says good is entirely good and bad is entirely bad. Either you are with us or you are against us. And the second is the conception which says we are all combinations of good and bad. And it is a human destiny to come to grips with combinations of good and bad that exist in all of us. And that may be the moment that has arrived where we have look inside and outside. What I call dual critique, dual, simultaneous, interrelated critique of the self and the other without privileging either. Which then creates the commitment to correct yourself when you are wrong and to have the courage of conviction when you are right. And I believe that today, as a Muslim, when I speak here, I speak of a Muslim charter of obligations. I believe Muslims have, as the citizens of this country, the duty and the obligation to defend this country physically. Defend it against violence, against terrorism, against war, against sabotage. I believe Muslims also have an intellectual obligation to defend this country intellectually. And that is to defend the values that make this country a unique country, a decent country, and those are the values of civil liberties and human rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of association. And third is to defend this country spiritually. And how do you defend a country spiritually? You defend it by respecting the humanity of all, creating a common cause with them. This is the charter of obligation that I believe we have at this time. Muslim organizations, 10 of them, have come together to create a task force on civil rights and elections. And I believe the issue of civil rights and the issue of war are very important not only for Muslims and Christian Arabs in this country, but for the US image and US role in the world at large. What we have in this country this time is a crisis of civil rights. And that crisis has been there before September 11, way before September 11. That actually started in some ways, and again I'm telling the story from the middle, it started in some ways with the law passed in 1996, Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which among other provisions had a secret evidence provision, which said if you are not a citizen of the United States, you can be tried in a court of law without evidence being shown to you or to your lawyer. Most of the people who were incarcerated under that were Palestinians. So it became an instrument of silencing Palestinian and Palestinian Americans in this country, and Dr. Mazen al-Najjar was in jail for 3.5 years without ever being proven guilty of any crime. In 1999, US Supreme Court, no other institution but US Supreme Court, in a very important decision, ADC versus Janet Reno, said if you are not a citizen, you have no protection against selective application of law. To say you have no protection against selective application of law is to say there is no equal justice in the United States. Different people can be tried differently with different kind of punishments. And then of course came the USA Patriot Act. Now what lies at the center of US Patriot Act is not simply an act of profiling, but the act of profiling of thought, belief and conscience. This is 1984. This is what exactly Orwell had said, thought policing. And how is that thought policing taking place? I'll give you concrete examples. Person coming out of a mosque in Orlando, Florida is stopped very much on the property of the mosque itself in the parking lot, and the FBI official says, I would like to know, what did you pray today? And what was your pre-sermon? What was the Imam sermon? When the government say, what did you pray today? That is profiling of thought and belief. And that defines the crisis, in my judgment, of the civil rights that exists in this country. Now, we have been engaged in a dialogue with the Democratic Party, and so far we have failed to hear from them a clear answer on the issue of civil rights. If you go to the Democratic Party's website, it says a document, something to the effect, says building bridges to the Muslim American community and so on and so forth. And when it talks about the USA Patriot Act, it says John Edwards and John Kerry support most aspects of the USA Patriot Act. So we want to ask the very specific questions, because we don't want to be in this vague, hazy area. What we want to know is, what is their position on due process, what is their position on equal justice, most importantly, what's their position on no ex post facto laws, no secret evidence, no secret proceedings, instituting habeas corpus, presumption of innocence till proven guilty in a court of law, access to a lawyer, and the confidentiality of communication between the lawyer and the accused person. It is precisely this fact that constitutes the crisis of civil rights in this country at this time. But I am very pleased to tell you, the way I read it, there is a tremendous civil rights movement in America today. And I believe since the end of Vietnam War, this country has not seen this kind of a movement. What I'm talking about is 341 cities and counties, independent of each other, passing resolutions and ordinances to seek repeal of the USA Patriot Act or parts of USA Patriot Act. There are 4 states that have passed resolutions to the same effect. There are 24 states, including my state, California, that is in the process of reflecting on that. Now, when many people, independent of each other, come to the same conclusion and move in the same direction, that to me is the beginning of a movement. What we have in this country today is a genuine grassroots civil rights movement. What we are lacking is a national figure or a national entity, more than a figure, an institution that could give it national expression and national coherence. I was hoping Mr. Rolf Nader will be here at this time so I could challenge him to that effect, but that would have to be next week when I see him in Chicago. So what we see here right now is the need, and I am proposing a partisan thing, that is a need to connect the issue of civil rights with elections. Because I believe elections, among other things, are a process in which larger issues can be brought to public attention, and one could proceed in the direction of finding solutions for that. So I would highly recommend you think of the election in terms of civil rights, also in terms of war. Now, it was former Congressman Pete McCloskey who spoke at one of our events, and he said, one of the central questions in this war is it going to be a war against terrorism or is it going to be a war against Islam? I think the question has not been answered. The question needs to be answered because it moves in very different directions. Secondly, we need to ask and answer very clearly and coherently, is it going to be a war of occupation or war of liberation? Because when we say it's a war of liberation, there are some fundamental problems with that very notion. Could war really be an instrument of social change of the type that we are talking about? Because let's remind ourselves, for the last 50 years there have been 2 movements for democracy in the world. One has been the movement for democracy in the world by the West, where the West has been calling on third world countries and second world countries to democratize themselves, to build institutions, to have coercion-free consent of the world in terms of who they want to lead them, and so on and so forth. But there has also been a demand by the third world countries for democracy among nations. The entire focus of the 9/9 movement was actually to seek democratization of the United Nations. Isn't it a hypocrisy of the whole system that after having said in the first section of the UN Charter